Dominic Carr's hands were shaking. That was the first thing he noticed. The second was the document spread across his mahogany desk. A birth certificate, 19 years old, faded at the edges from being folded and unfolded too many times. And there, in the space marked Father, his name, Dominic James Carr. He'd locked his office door, something he never did. The glass walls that usually made him feel powerful now felt like a trap. Anyone could see in, anyone could watch him fall apart. But no one was watching. It was past 8 in the evening. The 51st floor of Carr Industries headquarters was empty, except for him, and the truth he'd spent 18 years running from. Have you ever discovered something that shattered everything you thought you knew about yourself? Have you ever realized that the person standing 3 feet from you, the person you've worked alongside for months, was connected to you in a way that made your entire life a lie? What would you do if you found out the brilliant employee you'd been relying on, the young woman whose insight had saved your company millions, was the child you abandoned before she was even born? This is the story of how a billionaire CEO hired his own daughter and didn't recognize her until it was almost too late. This is the story of Mira Ashford, or should I say, Mira Carr, because that was her real name, the one her mother had written on that birth certificate 18 years ago, the one Dominic had refused to acknowledge, the one he'd called a lie in front of a room full of people who mattered. Outside his office, standing perfectly still near the elevator, Mira waited. She wasn't nervous. She'd prepared for this moment for 7 months. She knew he'd found the document. She'd made sure of it, buried it in the appendix of a restructuring report where only someone reading carefully would see it. And Dominic Carr always read carefully, she knew. She'd known from day one, and now he knew too. If you want to see how this impossible situation unfolds, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what happens next will challenge everything you believe about forgiveness, family, and second chances. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. 6 months earlier, Mira Ashford walked into Dominic Carr's office for the first time. She didn't look around the way most people did when they entered that space, didn't gawk at the floor-to-ceiling windows or the view of London stretched out like a kingdom below, didn't try to read him or impress him or position herself for advantage. She just stood 3 paces from his desk and waited. Dominic was signing off on an acquisition brief. Numbers, projections, the architecture of corporate conquest rendered in clean columns. His pen moved with the same decisive authority that had built Carr Industries from a single logistics startup into a £2 billion empire. He didn't look up, not at first. Looking up implied interest, and interest implied equality. In Dominic's world, equality had to be earned. When he finally raised his eyes, he saw someone who didn't fit into the categories his mind automatically constructed. Early 20s, dressed in a charcoal blazer that fit well but had no designer label, minimal jewelry, dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency rather than fashion. But it was her eyes that held him longer than he intended, watchful, intelligent, the kind of gaze that absorbed rather than sought approval. "You're younger than I expected," he said. His voice carried the particular flatness he used to establish hierarchy without effort. "I won't disappoint you," she replied. "Not, I'll work hard. Not, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Just a statement of fact," delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had already calculated the distance between expectation and delivery and found no gap. Dominic held her gaze for another heartbeat. Then he returned to his brief. "See that you don't," he said. She didn't move, didn't thank him, didn't leave, just stood there for exactly 3 more seconds. Then she turned and walked out. Her footsteps made no sound on the polished floor. She moved like someone who knew how to occupy space without announcing herself, like someone who had learned early that silence was a form of power. What Dominic Carr could not have known, what the carefully constructed fortress of his professional life had been designed to prevent him from knowing, was that the young woman who had just left his office was Mira Ashford, and that her real name, the one that appeared on documents her mother had locked in a safety deposit box 18 years ago, was Mira Carr. Ashford wasn't a deception. It was a lifeline. Her mother, Natalie, had taken it when she remarried, taking the surname of Gregory Ashford, the man who had arrived in their lives when Mira was 14 months old, the man who had chosen to stay when another man had chosen to leave before he'd even known what leaving would cost. But to understand why Mira was standing in that office, why she'd applied to car industries in the first place, you have to go back. Not 6 months, 18 years. The restaurant was expensive, the kind of place where silence had weight and conversations were conducted in tones that didn't carry past your own table. Natalie Brennan sat across from Dominic Carr, 24 years old, brilliant, a junior consultant at a firm that had just landed Carr Industries as a client. She'd been working with Dominic for 3 months, long enough to know he was ruthless, long enough to know he was brilliant, long enough to fall in love with him, even though she knew better. She'd waited until the meal was nearly finished, until the server had cleared their plates and brought coffee, until the moment felt as safe as it was ever going to feel. "I'm pregnant," she said. Dominic didn't react, not at first. He lifted his coffee cup, took a sip, set it down with the same precision he brought to everything. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't surprise or fear or even anger. It was calculation. "You're lying," he said. The words hit her like cold water. "I'm not lying, Dominic." He leaned back in his chair. "You're after money. You saw an opportunity, and you took it. I respect the ambition. I really do. But I'm not interested." She felt her face flush. "This isn't about money. This is about our child." "Our child," he repeated, the way you'd repeat a phrase in a language you didn't speak. He shook his head. "You don't know me as well as you think you do, Natalie. I don't make mistakes like this, and I don't let other people's mistakes become mine." She stared at him, trying to find some trace of the man she thought she'd known, the man who'd talked to her about his childhood, about building something that mattered, about legacy. But that man wasn't there. Or maybe he'd never been there. Maybe she'd constructed him out of hope and proximity, and the dangerous belief that intelligence and ambition could coexist with decency. "I'm keeping it," she said quietly. "That's your choice," he said. "But don't expect anything from me. And don't use my name, because if you do, if you try to make this public, I'll destroy you. I'll make sure no one in this industry ever hires you again. I'll make you disappear." He stood, dropped 2 50-pound notes on the table, and walked out. Natalie sat there for a long time, long enough that the server came by twice to ask if she needed anything, long enough that the restaurant began to empty, long enough to understand that the life she'd imagined, the future she'd been quietly building in her mind, was gone. But here's what Dominic didn't know. Here's what he couldn't have predicted. Natalie Brennan wasn't the kind of woman who disappeared. She was the kind who rebuilt, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing herself. She left London, moved to Bristol, started her own consulting firm, married Gregory Ashford 2 years later. A kind man, a good man, a man who loved Mira like she was his own, because in every way that mattered, she was. And she never told Mira who her biological father was. Not when she was 5, not when she was 10, not when she was 15 and started asking questions about why she didn't look like Gregory. She told her when Mira turned 18, the day after her birthday. They sat in the kitchen of their townhouse. Natalie made tea, and then she told her daughter the truth. Not because Mira needed to know, because Natalie needed to stop carrying it alone. Mira listened without interrupting. When her mother finished, when the whole ugly story was out in the open, Mira asked one question: "Does he know I exist?" Natalie shook her head. He convinced himself I was lying, and I never corrected him. Mira was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I want to meet him." Natalie's face went pale. "No, not to punish him," Mira said. "Not to make him pay. I just want to understand who he is. And then I want to decide for myself whether he's worth forgiving." That conversation happened 4 years ago, and for 4 years, Mira did nothing. She finished school, started university, studied business and logistics and supply chain management. She was brilliant. Everyone said so. Focused, driven, the kind of student professors remembered. But she was also watching, researching, learning everything she could about car industries, about Dominic Carr, not obsessively, methodically, the way she approached everything. And 7 months before she walked into his office for the first time, she made a decision. Mira sat at the kitchen table in her mother's townhouse, her laptop open, a legal pad covered in notes beside her. She'd been studying car industries for 4 months. Not just the public information, the archived reports, the supplier relationships, the internal restructuring documents that were technically public, but buried deep enough that most people never looked. She knew car industry's supply chain vulnerabilities better than half the people who worked there. She'd mapped their exposure in Southeast Asia before it became a boardroom problem. She knew where they were overextended and where they were leaving money on the table. She wasn't doing it to impress anyone. She was doing it because if she was going to walk into Dominic Carr's world, she needed to be undeniable. She needed to be so good that he couldn't ignore her, so valuable that he'd want her close. Her mother walked in carrying 2 mugs of tea. She stopped when she saw what was on the screen: the car industry's careers page, the senior analyst training program, application deadline in 3 days. Mira, Natalie said, just her name, but in her voice, 18 years of protective silence. I'm applying, Mira said without looking up. The program accepts 12 candidates. I'll be one of them. Natalie set both mugs down slowly. The way you handle something fragile when your hands want to shake. No, Mom, no. Firmer now. The voice Natalie had spent 18 years building. The voice of a woman who had survived public humiliation and financial devastation, and the particular loneliness of raising a child alone while the man responsible lived 60 miles away in a glass tower. I won't let you do this. Mira finally looked at her. I'm not asking permission. Then what are you doing? Trying to understand. Mira's voice remained calm, but something moved beneath it. Not anger, something more complicated. You've told me the facts. What he said, what he did, how he erased us. But facts aren't the same as understanding. Understanding won't change what he is. Maybe not, Mira said, but I need to know if he's worth forgiving, and I can't decide that from a distance. The silence that followed was the kind that contains entire arguments compressed into stillness. Natalie looked at her daughter, this young woman who had her father's jawline, his intensity, his particular way of tilting her head when processing complexity, and she felt the old wound open just enough to remind her it had never fully healed. He destroyed me, Natalie said quietly. Not just my reputation. He made me feel like I'd imagined my own life, like what happened between us was something I'd fabricated for money. She stopped. I rebuilt myself from that. But you're asking me to watch you walk into his world. I'm asking you to trust me, Mira said. Not him. Me. Natalie didn't answer that night. But 3 days later, when Mira submitted the application, she didn't stop her. She sat at the kitchen table, pressed her palms flat against the wood grain, and breathed. The application process for car industry's senior analyst program was brutal by design. 1,600 applicants, 12 positions, 4 rounds of interviews, case studies, psychometric testing, panel presentations. It was designed to break people, to find the ones who didn't break. Mira's first interview lasted 40 minutes longer than any other candidate's, not because she struggled, because every answer she gave made the panel ask another question. She knew car industry's supply chain vulnerabilities better than 2 of the senior directors who interviewed her. She'd mapped their Southeast Asia exposure before it became a boardroom problem. She didn't mention how she knew. She just spoke clearly, without performance, without trying to impress. One of the interviewers, a woman named Sarah Chen who'd been with the company for 15 years, made a note on her evaluation form. Hire immediately. The call came 2 weeks later. Mira was in a lecture hall. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. London area code. She stepped outside. Ms. Ashford, the voice said. This is Victoria Cross from Car Industries. We'd like to offer you a position in our senior analyst program. Mira closed her eyes. Thank you, she said. I accept. She heard the call from the kitchen, heard Mira's voice. Calm, professional, controlled. She didn't come out to celebrate. She sat down at the table, pressed her hands flat against the wood, and tried to breathe through the fear that felt like it was crushing her chest. Her sister called 20 minutes later. Natalie told her everything. What if he recognizes her? Natalie said. He won't, her sister replied. You said it yourself. He convinced himself you were lying. He never even tried to find out if it was true. Men like that don't see what they don't want to see. But what if she gets hurt? Then she'll survive it, her sister said gently. The same way you did. Natalie wanted to believe that, but belief and fear don't cancel each other out. They just sit side by side, and you learn to carry both. Mira started the program 3 weeks later. 12 analysts, all brilliant, all driven, all desperate to prove they belonged. The first week was orientation, lectures, policy briefings, tours of the building, meet and greets with department heads. Dominic Carr appeared on day 3. He walked into the conference room where the analysts were gathered, didn't introduce himself, didn't need to. Everyone knew who he was. "You're here because you're exceptional," he said. "But exceptional isn't enough. Half of you won't make it past the probation period. The ones who do will have earned it. Don't waste my time. Don't waste yours." He left. The whole thing took 90 seconds, but Mira felt it like a physical blow. Seeing him in person, hearing his voice, not from a recording, not from a video, right there, 3 meters away. He didn't look at her, didn't single her out, didn't give any indication that she was different from the 11 other people in that room. And she realized something in that moment. He really didn't know. He'd buried her so deeply in his past that even standing in front of him, she was invisible. It should have hurt, but it didn't. It gave her power, because she could see him, and he couldn't see her. The first 2 weeks were a blur of assignments, analysis, presentations, late nights and early mornings. Mira kept her head down, delivered exceptional work, didn't seek attention, didn't try to stand out, just did the job better than anyone else. The other analysts started noticing. There was a guy named Marcus who'd gone to Oxford. Brilliant, competitive. He watched Mira the way you watch someone who's beating you at a game you thought you'd mastered. "You make the rest of us look bad," he said one afternoon. Half joking, half serious. Mira smiled. "That's not my job." "What is your job?" "To be undeniable." The crisis meeting happened on day 9. A supplier in Krakow had suddenly increased their rates, 40%. No warning, no negotiation, just a new contract and a deadline. Sign it, or the entire Central European supply chain collapses. The meeting room was full. Regional directors, senior operations staff, people who'd been with car industries for a decade or more. And at the far end of the table, the 12 analysts, there to observe, to learn, not to speak. The conversation went in circles for 90 minutes. Renegotiate, find an alternative supplier, absorb the cost temporarily. Legal action. Every solution had a problem. Every problem had a cost. Mira set down her pen. "The problem isn't the rate increase," she said. The room went quiet. Dominic, sitting at the head of the table, turned to look at her. She met his eyes, didn't flinch. "Then what is it?" he said. "Not a question, a challenge." "The problem is that we designed the partnership with no incentive alignment," Mira said. "They have nothing to gain by keeping rates stable. We penalize them for failing to meet quotas, but we've never rewarded them for exceeding expectations. Restructure the incentive model. Make their success tied to ours. The rate problem disappears. The tension in building, and neither of them realizes how close they are to the truth." Drop a comment below. Do you think Dominic suspects anything? And don't forget to subscribe, because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. One of the directors, a man named Colin Reese, who'd been with the company for 12 years, leaned back in his chair. "She's right," he said. Dominic looked at Mira for a long moment. She'd already picked her pen back up, already returned to her notes, like she hadn't just solved a problem that had stumped a room full of people with a combined 70 years of experience. After the meeting dispersed, Dominic stopped near the door. "How long have you been in the program?" he asked. 9 days, Mira said. He didn't respond, but he didn't forget. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Dominic began requesting Mira specifically for projects, not warmly, not personally, but with the clinical efficiency of someone who recognized competence and used it. She delivered analyses ahead of deadlines, anticipated questions before they were asked, had an unsettling ability to read the emotional subtext of a negotiation while everyone else was still parsing the contract language. But there was something else Dominic couldn't name, a familiarity that had no source. The way Mira stood near windows when she was thinking, looking out rather than at her phone. The particular pause before she answered difficult questions. Not hesitation, precision. The tilt of her head when she was absorbing information. like she was filing it into some internal architecture only she could see. He knew these gestures. He'd never cataloged them consciously, but he knew them the way you know the weight of your own hands. He didn't examine the feeling. He had spent a career building systems to avoid examining feelings, but it was there, persistent, like a frequency just below hearing that changes the quality of silence. Mira was navigating something equally complex. She'd spent 4 years constructing a clear idea of who Dominic Carr was. A villain was easier. A villain didn't make you feel anything except anger, and anger was a clean emotion. Anger didn't ask you to decide anything, but proximity complicated the narrative. She saw him in meetings, decisive, cold, precise, a man who treated uncertainty like an enemy and processed every room for leverage before he said a word. But she also saw the other version. She'd stayed late one evening to finish a logistics assessment, came back to the executive floor to retrieve a tablet she'd left behind. The office lights were still on. Through the glass wall, she saw Dominic alone at his desk, not working, just sitting. In his hands, he held something small, a photograph, printed, with edges worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. He wasn't studying it. He was just holding it, the way you hold something that hurts but you can't let go of. The moment he sensed her presence, he returned the photograph to his desk drawer, pulled up a document on his screen, the mask back in place. "Forgot my tablet," Mira said from the doorway. "Take it," Dominic replied, already absorbed in whatever he was pretending to read. Mira collected the tablet and left, but the image stayed with her. This man who had told a pregnant woman she was a liar, who had dismantled her mother's reputation to protect his own, who had spent 18 years never once attempting to verify whether the child was real. This man kept something he looked at, alone, in silence, when he thought no one was watching. It didn't redeem him, but it made him human in a way that was harder to dismiss, and Mira didn't know what to do with that. The photograph wasn't the only crack in the facade. There were small moments. A comment Dominic made during a supplier negotiation about loyalty being more valuable than efficiency. The way he paused when one of the junior staff made a mistake, not to humiliate them, to correct them. The particular tone he used when he was genuinely impressed, rather than strategically flattering. Mira started keeping a mental list, evidence, not of goodness, of complexity, and complexity was harder to hate. 3 months into the program, Natalie saw the photograph. It was embedded in a Financial Times piece about car industry's expansion into renewable energy infrastructure. The image showed Dominic at a press conference, and just behind him, slightly to his left, stood Mira, hands clasped in front of her, shoulders back, watching the room with the same controlled intensity Dominic had always brought to public spaces. Natalie stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she called her sister. "She looks like him," Natalie said when her sister answered. There was a pause. "Nat, she always has. I know. I've always known. But I told myself it didn't matter, that no one else would see it." Natalie's voice didn't break, but it wavered. "But if I can see it in a photograph, if I can see them standing the same way, does she understand what she's risking?" "She thinks she does," her sister said gently. "She's 22, Natalie said. "She's brilliant, and she has no idea how much this could cost her." 3 floors below Dominic's office, Mira was learning things no interview had prepared her for. She'd studied Dominic from a distance, read profiles, watched recorded speeches, analyzed his professional decisions with the detachment of an anthropologist examining a foreign culture. She'd constructed a clear image, ruthless, calculating, a man who treated human connection as a liability and built walls out of competence. But working alongside him daily revealed contradictions. He was ruthless in negotiations, but he was also fair. He demanded excellence, but he also noticed when people were struggling and quietly redistributed workloads without making it obvious. He was emotionally distant, but he remembered details: a team member's sick parent, an analyst's upcoming exam, things that didn't serve him strategically, but that he paid attention to anyway. Mira started to realize that Dominic Carr wasn't a villain. He was a man who'd made a terrible choice 18 years ago and had spent every day since building a life that justified that choice. A life so successful, so impenetrable, that he never had to look back and question whether he'd been wrong. That was harder to forgive than cruelty, because cruelty was a flaw. This was a system, and systems were designed to sustain themselves. 4 months in, something shifted. Mira and Dominic were working late on a merger assessment. Just the two of them. The office was quiet. The city below had gone dark, except for the scattered lights of buildings that never slept. They'd been working in silence for an hour when Dominic spoke. "You think differently," he said. Mira looked up. "What do you mean?" "Most people approach problems linearly. You approach them structurally. You don't ask what's wrong. You ask why the system allows it to be wrong." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." Mira returned to her screen. "My father taught me that." He'd never asked about her family, never asked about anything personal, because personal meant connection and connection meant vulnerability. "What does he do?" Dominic asked. "He's a teacher," Mira said. "Philosophy. He taught me that every problem is an answer to a question we're not asking." Dominic nodded. "Smart man." "He is." The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. Some invisible boundary had been crossed, and neither of them acknowledged it, because acknowledging it would mean examining it. The file surfaced on a Thursday. Dominic had been reviewing archived consultant records, a routine compliance audit stretching back 8 years. His assistant had pulled legacy files that included external contracts, temporary engagements, brief consulting arrangements. He almost didn't see it. Natalie Ashford. A 2-month consulting engagement from 9 years ago, before she'd built her own firm, before she'd become fully independent. The name stopped him. He hadn't said it aloud in years, hadn't let himself think it. He'd buried it with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything, filed it away in the part of his mind reserved for mistakes he'd decided didn't matter, because acknowledging them would cost too much. But names don't stay buried. They wait. He sat with the file open, closed it, opened it again. He looked at the date of the engagement, ran the timeline without meaning to, felt the calculation land somewhere deep, like something dropped from a great height. He thought about the young woman, the stillness, the way she stood at windows, the tilt of her head, the particular quality of silence she carried everywhere. Coincidence, he told himself. He said it the way a man says it's nothing about a pain he's been ignoring for months, with the practiced calm of someone who has decided that not looking is the same as not knowing. He closed the file, but he didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running timelines, doing math he didn't want to do, remembering a woman he'd convinced himself had lied to him, remembering the moment he'd chosen his reputation over the possibility that she'd been telling the truth. And he thought about Mira Ashford, 22 years old, brilliant, unnervingly familiar, standing in his office every day, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 18 years. Fear. The confrontation arrived quietly. Mira had prepared a restructuring analysis, detailed, thorough, exactly what had been requested, but buried in the appendix, in a section most people wouldn't read carefully, she'd included a reference, a legal filing, 19 years old, a paternity dispute, dismissed, sealed, forgotten. It wasn't an accident. She'd put it there deliberately, not as an attack, as an opening. She was done waiting, done watching. If she was going to decide what this man meant, if she was going to choose forgiveness or distance or something else entirely, she needed him to be real, not a performance, not a corporate persona. Real. Dominic read the report in his office, alone. He reached the appendix, saw the reference, read it twice. He sat very still for 40 seconds. Then he called Mira in. She walked in and stood where she always stood, 3 paces from the desk, calm, hands at her sides. Dominic looked at her for a long time without speaking. In 2 decades of building an empire, he'd learned to read people, their tells, their vulnerabilities, the gap between what they said and what they meant. He didn't need to read anything now. It was already there, had been there for weeks, in her eyes, in the line of her jaw, in the particular quality of silence she carried. "Is it true?" he said. His voice was different, stripped of its usual armor. Mira didn't look away. "You tell me." The silence held the weight of 18 years. Dominic stood slowly, like a man whose legs have forgotten how to hold him. He moved to the window, the same window Mira always gravitated toward, and looked out at the city. When he turned back, Something in his face had changed. Not broken, not transformed, just open. The way something becomes open when it's been locked too long, and the effort of keeping it shut finally exceeds the fear of what's inside. "Your mother," he said. "Natalie." "Yes." The silence stretched. Dominic felt it pressing against his chest. All the decisions he'd made, all the things he'd told himself to make those decisions bearable. "I told myself she was lying," he said, each word chosen with the care of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that words had consequences that outlasted the moment they were spoken. "I told myself it was calculated, that she saw an opportunity and took it." He paused. "I needed to believe that, because the alternative was that I chose my reputation over a person, over a child." "Was it easier?" Mira asked, believing she was lying. The question wasn't cruel. It was precise. The same precision she applied to business problems, now applied to this. "Yes," Dominic said. "Good," Mira said. "Then you already know what you did." There was no yelling, no accusations thrown like weapons. Just two people in a glass office on the 51st floor, and the long, quiet aftermath of a choice made 18 years ago. "I didn't come here to punish you," Mira said. Her voice was steady. "I came because I needed to know if you were someone I could understand." She paused. "Not forgive, not yet, just understand." "And?" Dominic asked. Mira took her time. "You're more complicated than I wanted you to be." "That's not a compliment, but it's the truth." Dominic sat down slowly, like the weight of standing had become too much. "Do you hate me?" he asked. "I don't know you well enough to hate you, but you know what I did." "Yes," Mira said, "and what you did was unforgivable. But I'm not here to decide whether you deserve forgiveness. I'm here to decide whether I want to carry what you did for the rest of my life, or whether I want to put it down." Dominic looked at her, this young woman who had his eyes, his intensity, his particular way of processing the world, and he realized something. She wasn't here for him. She was here for herself, and that was somehow more devastating than if she'd come for revenge. "Does your mother know you're here?" he asked. "She knows." "And?" "She didn't stop me." Dominic nodded. He wanted to ask more, wanted to know if Natalie hated him, if she'd moved on, if she'd built a good life, but he didn't have the right to ask. And he knew it. "What happens now?" he said. "That depends on you," Mira replied. Natalie arrived at the building an hour later. Mira had texted her 3 words. "He knows." "Come." She stood in the lobby, adjusting the strap of her bag, looking at the elevator like it led somewhere she'd spent 18 years avoiding. Then she stepped inside. When she walked into the office, Dominic was standing near the window. He turned when he heard the door. They looked at each other across the room. 18 years of silence, of separate lives built carefully, deliberately, in the wreckage of a single brutal season. "Natalie," he said. Her name broke slightly in his mouth. She didn't cross the room. She stood near the door, her posture neither defensive nor yielding, just present. "She asked me not to stop her," Natalie said. "So I didn't. I want you to know, this was her choice, not mine." "I know," Dominic said. She looked at her daughter, standing quietly to the side. That familiar stillness, that patience Natalie had spent years marveling at, wondering where it came from, knowing even as she wondered. "She has your eyes," Natalie said to Dominic. "I always told myself she had mine." Mira almost smiled. Dominic tried to speak. Couldn't. Tried again. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't change anything. But I'm sorry." Natalie nodded. She didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. She didn't say she forgave him, because she hadn't. She just nodded. Acknowledgement without absolution. Can you imagine the emotional weight in that room? 3 people bound by one devastating choice made 18 years ago. If this story is hitting you in the chest, smash that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because we're not done yet. The hardest part is still ahead. Weeks passed, then months. Dominic tried. That was the part the story had to hold honestly, because it would have been easier, cleaner, to say he didn't. A man who never changes is a simple villain, easy to keep at a distance. But Dominic tried. He didn't do it with grand gestures. didn't hire publicists or craft apologies designed to make himself the protagonist of his own redemption. He did it the way people do it, when they know they have no right to expect anything. Quietly, at cost to himself, without performance. He restructured his schedule, called Mira, not to talk business, just to talk. The conversations were awkward at first, stilted. Neither of them knew how to navigate the territory between professional and personal, between stranger and family. "How was your day?" he'd ask. "Fine," she'd say. Silence. "I read your assessment on the German contracts," he'd try. "And?" "It was excellent. Thank you." More silence. But slowly, over weeks, the silences became less uncomfortable. They started filling them with small things. An article Mira had read, a decision Dominic was struggling with. Nothing deep, nothing that required vulnerability, just the scaffolding of connection. He reached out to Natalie, too, not to apologize in the language designed to benefit the apologizer, but to say things that mattered. "I know what I cost you. I know I can't return it. I'm not asking forgiveness. I'm asking to be better in whatever time remains." Natalie didn't respond right away. She sat with his words for days, turned them over, examined them for manipulation or performance, and found none, just honesty, raw and uncomfortable. She called him 3 weeks later. They met for coffee, not at the expensive restaurant where he destroyed her 18 years ago, at a small cafe in Bristol, neutral ground. She didn't forgive him, not in the clean, tidy way that stories sometimes demand, but she stopped carrying it the way she had been, like something toxic tucked against her chest. She put it down, not for him, for herself. That was its own kind of freedom. Mira watched both of them. Her mother learning to let go, her father learning to be present, and she realized something. Forgiveness wasn't a single decision. It was a process, a series of small choices made over and over, to show up, to try, to not run when things got hard. 4 months after the revelation, Mira received an offer, a permanent position at Car Industries, senior analyst, competitive salary, earned completely above board. She stared at the email for a long time. Then she called her mother. "What do you think?" Mira asked. "I think you need to decide what you want," Natalie said. "Not what I want, not what he wants. What you want." Mira thought about it for 2 weeks, had conversations with herself, with her mother, with Gregory, the man who'd raised her, who'd been her father in every way that mattered, who told her that biology doesn't determine family. Choice does. She accepted the position, not because she'd forgiven Dominic, not because she'd decided he deserved a relationship with her, but because she'd decided she deserved the career she'd earned. And she wasn't going to let his past mistakes determine her future. Her first day as a permanent employee felt different. She walked into Dominic's office, not as a trainee, not as someone trying to prove herself, as a colleague, as someone who belonged. Dominic looked up when she entered. "You're early," he said. "I know." She set her bag down at the chair across from his desk, the same chair she'd stood beside that first morning when he hadn't looked up. This time Dominic looked up. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, something older than either. The particular expression of a man who has stopped deserving something and is being given it anyway, and knows the difference. "I'm not here because you're my father," Mira said. "I want you to understand that." "I do," Dominic said. "I'm here because you're trying." She held his gaze. "Don't stop." She opened her laptop. Dominic returned to his document. For a while, the only sound in the office was the city below, and the quiet turning of two people figuring out slowly what it means to start. He didn't get his daughter back. He got something harder, something more honest, a second chance to become someone worthy of her. Mira didn't get the father she'd imagined as a child. She got the truth, and the truth gave her the power to choose. Natalie didn't get justice, but she got peace. And sometimes peace is the better gift, because here's what this story teaches us. Some mistakes can't be erased, only transformed. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about deciding what you'll carry forward. Family isn't always blood, but sometimes blood gets a second chance to become family. And it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. It's never too late to choose differently, to show up, to try, even when you don't deserve it, even when the cost is high, even when the outcome is uncertain. Dominic and Mira didn't get a fairy tale ending. They got something real. They got the chance to build something new from the ruins of what was lost. And that's harder than a fairy tale, but it's also more honest. 6 months after Mira started her permanent position, Dominic asked her to lunch, not at his usual place, at a small restaurant she'd mentioned liking. They sat across from each other, ordered, made small talk about work. Then, Dominic set down his fork. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Mira nodded. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" She took her time answering. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe, maybe not. But I think I'm learning that forgiveness isn't the point." "Then what is?" "Understanding." She met his eyes. "I understand why you did what you did. I understand you were afraid. I understand you built a life that made it easier to believe my mother was lying than to face the possibility that you'd made a terrible choice." She paused. "Understanding doesn't excuse it, but it makes you human. And I can work with human." Dominic nodded. "That's more than I deserve." "Probably," Mira said. "But I'm not giving it to you because you deserve it. I'm giving it to you because I deserve peace." They finished their meal, walked back to the office, side by side. Not father and daughter. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the traditional sense. But two people learning to navigate the complicated space between stranger and family. And that was enough. For now, that was enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own choices, your own second chances, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me what you felt. And subscribe to Mr. Andy Love Stories, because every week we bring you narratives that don't just entertain, they transform. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be.